Psychology, welcome to the Psychology of Personality. I find myself saying this quite a lot when I'm teaching. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I oftentimes say in class that I like teaching about things that are practical and relevant to my students, and 100% of my students have a personality. And perhaps you have a friend, someone you know, and you have wondered if they had a personality. You had questions about your personality. But I think this is really important because although you have a personality, you may not be the best at describing your personality. Usually when I ask students in class to simply explain and describe their personality, this becomes harder. They say things like, well, I'm good, I'm a nice person, I'm a cool person, or maybe something like extroverted or introverted. And I can guarantee you that when you apply for a job, this will be one of the most important questions, usually one of the questions that are early in an interview. And you just come into situations all throughout your life where you will need to be able to explain your personality. And it's also important to know what jobs and situations might be a good fit for you, given your personality. So I've had a lot of fun over the years helping students describe their personality, and that's one of the things we'll do today. But in order to get through to the practical aspect, we do have to understand our terms. So personality is defined as the unique and stable way that people think and feel and behave over the course of their life. So personality involves your unique signature style of thinking and feeling and behaving. We have to differentiate between personality and some terms. If I were to ask whether or not you're extroverted or introverted, you could tell me. But that would tell me nothing about your ethics and nothing about your morals. I could describe a person who is extremely charismatic and outgoing, and people, when meeting this person, feels very drawn to them and would say they have a great energy in their extroversion. But I have just described many cult leaders, serial killers, and tyrannical leaders. Oftentimes, just because you're extroverted doesn't mean you're a good person. And just because you're introverted doesn't mean you're a good person. So we like to specify and operationalize personality in the sense that it's not character, it's also not temperament. I describe temperament as the building block of your personality, and it's oftentimes the very first thing that's seen in your life by your parents. We describe a child that's an easy baby. That's an easy temperament, right? They like being held. They're kind of predictable in their feeding times. And you also have babies who are slow to warm up, that they are very reticent or tentative about meeting new people. But that doesn't necessarily mean they will be that way the entire life. So character, we're talking about the enduring characteristics that really you're born with. With temperament, it is what you're born with. Character is a value judgment about your morals and your ethics. With personality, we have had different schools that have dominated the thought over the years. You have four. It's important that we mention them and give some thought to them. So we have the psychodynamic school, which is Sigmund Freud and the Neo-Freudians, those who would follow him. You have the behavioral school of thought, John Watson, B.F. Skinner, and others that really emphasize the importance of reward and early reinforcement into our habits. There is a quote that we hear a lot, that you are what you repeatedly do. Excellence then is not, it is a habit. And so I paraphrase that, but the behaviorists believe that personality is a series of habits. I'll talk more about the psychodynamic school. The humanists emphasize free will and personal choice. You are who you choose to be. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow talk about the qualities that are innate and needed, things like self-actualization and fulfillment and your own role in pursuing fulfillment, and the importance of parents giving you the space to be who you are. And then finally, trait theory. Trait theory has a biological emphasis. The emphasis in trait theory is on genetics. They would contend that your personality is largely inherited, at least 50% of it, and the environment simply modifies those traits. And so each of these are still discussed. Research is still being produced that works from these different perspectives. So we do have to discuss the history of personality theory. You got to begin with Sigmund Freud and the psychodynamic school. Sigmund Freud emphasized the unconscious mind. You have to understand something about his background, something about where he comes from. He was working in Austria, Vienna, which was known for what your authors will refer to as sexual repression. It was a very conservative society which didn't believe in any form of birth control. The idea was that sexuality was only for procreation and not recreation at all, but yet people still had extramarital affairs, and it kind of perpetuated this idea that people, all people, especially men, couldn't control their drives, specifically the sex drive, the aggressive drive. And Freud really took this context and really, you think of it as a canvas upon which he painted. And his theory would really work from this premise that we are all driven towards socially unacceptable behavior, and specifically how the mom interacts with the child's uncontrollable desires, right? That helps shape these early childhood experiences. So his basis for his theory is the unconscious mind. So here you have a picture of Freud, an iceberg. This is an image that's oftentimes used because the Freudian idea of the unconscious mind is really important. 70% of who you are is outside of your ability to know from his perspective. 70%. So the structure of your personality, the very surface, that which you are aware of, is just the tip of the iceberg. Say 30% of who you are, according to Freud, is unknown. And well, it is that which you are aware of. You're around your surroundings and your consciousness. Your preconscious would be that which you might be aware of when you're sleeping and you're dreaming. He believed that the dreaming experience was the preconscious. So when you lay down, things from your unconscious mind may bubble up towards the surface. That's why he used dreams so much in therapy. You would write down your dreams that you remember. When you came into psychoanalysis, you'd lay down. The idea is that your unconscious mind is more vulnerable to let something slip into consciousness. And here you have someone to analyze your dreams. The unconscious mind is almost impossible to retrieve unless you have someone like Freud. He believed that your personality was divided into 3 parts. These are really important for tests. The id works via the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, when it wants it, without thought of consequence. Superego works via the morality principle. And this is your conscience. It's also the ego ideal, which is the person you think you should be, as well as everything your parents ever punished you for is sort of stored here in your subconscious. So deep, deep in the superego would be every memory of getting in trouble by everyone. There's a story of my parents that I was in the church nursery when I was just 2 years old, and I said a dirty word. I don't remember what this word is, but the nursery worker apparently thought that this word was so bad that she washed my mouth out with soap. And I do not remember what I said. My parents never told me if they knew. But the one part of the story that's consistent is that I got my mouth washed out with soap. I remember an exchange with this nursery worker, but don't remember the washing out of my mouth. I was probably younger than 4. One of my earliest memories is just of this woman. But according to Freudian theory, okay, this experience of being punished is stored deep in my subconscious mind, and it is currently still impacting my conscience, specifically my guilty conscience. If I ever were to think of something, maybe think of a word that I would feel guilty. Freud believes your conscience comes from the superego. Now, if you listen to your superego too much, you don't have any friends because you're too pious and too self-righteous. If you listen to your id too much, you get arrested, divorced, fired, probably die, because you're only thinking about what you want at that moment. The ego, however, is what keeps you married. It is what keeps your job. The ego works via the reality principle. And the ego is a mediator between the id and superego. The ego is trying to get you what you want in a way that's not going to get you arrested, fired, injured, harmed. So it's constantly trying to find a way to make socially unacceptable impulses acceptable. And this is the basis of his theory. Now, his theory of personality is referred to as stages of psychosexual development. Now, that's a strange word. It probably, if you're sitting in a lecture and you see that, you're immediately shocked. The word psycho, you might think of the old horror movie Psycho, or you might think of psychology. The original, like I said, Greek word means soul. But Freud used psyche to speak of this unconscious mind. He's not talking about your concept of the soul, the Western sort of Judeo-Christian ideal of the soul. Philosophical discussion of the soul is not entering here. When he talks about the psyche, he's talking about your unconscious mind. And when he says psychosexual, Freud believes that there is no difference between your sexual maturity, getting to the point from the time you're born to the time that you could produce children, if you're female, the time you could become pregnant, or male, the time that you could become a dad, the time when you're biologically capable of reproducing. He sees no difference between sexual maturity and your personality development. For him, they're one and the same. And that may be very, very strange for you, but to understand Freud, you have to understand the psychosexual stage theory is directly tied in to his theory of the unconscious mind. Okay, so he believed that fixation happens, right? Fixation happens when you get stuck in a stage-relevant personality trait. So as you're moving through these 5 stages, if your parents punish you too much for trying to get what you want, what your id wants, if you're punished too hard or not enough, you have long-standing personality problems. Now, that's the basis of the theory. What I like to do is give you all 5 of these stages. I think I'll move through to this chart here. This chart kind of helps us discuss this the easiest. So Freud had 5 stages: the oral, the anal, the phallic, latency, and the genital phase. And each of these becomes the focus of a child depending on how old they are, according to Freud. Now look at the note at the bottom. Freud thought that the way a person finds pleasure or is prevented from satisfying urges for pleasure at each stage affects personality. So thus, like other stage theorists, Freud's model argues that the way a person deals with psychological challenges or conflict has long-term effects on personality. So let me explain what that means. When a child is born, they are in the oral stage, which means the child is preoccupied with putting things in their mouth. If you've ever been around young kids, you know they will make very sucking noises. They will put everything in their mouth and really will all the way till they're about 18 months. Even when they start crawling around, they're picking up things, and that's how they're processing information. But for Freud, this was not just about processing information. It was more about pleasure. Freud even almost sexualizes infancy, and as a person who worked in child sexual abuse, the feminist movement, early childhood specialists, and many have criticized Freud for almost sexualizing children. There have been many cases where defense attorneys defending adults accused of sexually assaulting children have used Freud's theory to basically blame the victim. For Freud, it's important to note, however, there is no way that he could prove that any of this is, you can't prove or really disprove theory. So you cannot prove that children are necessarily going in through some kind of subconscious defense mechanism, the oral stage. However, this theory really became dominant in the field. And we're just teaching a theory at this point. So from birth to a year and a half, oral activities are primarily important. And the primary conflict here is weaning. And if the mother is too intense or too passive during this phase, then some things can happen later in life. So according to Freud, if you have difficulty forming relationships, for him, breastfeeding was really important. So you probably have difficulty making friends if your mother didn't breastfeed you. That's exactly how he thought. Because, as a youngster, what gives you pleasure is breastfeeding. Now, modern day psychologists will emphasize the hormonal benefits. There's actually hormones that are released, both the mother and the child, that actually help brain development and they help socio-emotional development. But for Freud, it wasn't he didn't focus on the neurology, even though he was trained as a neurologist. Neurology just as a discipline had not come that far, because today we benefit from computers and brain imaging. But for Freud, he theorized that your ability to form interpersonal attachments comes from whether or not you get what you want. If your mother doesn't breastfeed you, then this creates a sense of being overly, perhaps you don't form attachments. It creates your basic feeling about the world. You could be pessimistic if your mom doesn't breastfeed you. On the other hand, if your mom is not weaning you, if your mother is breastfeeding you too long, then you really become a person who's very, very, very pessimistic, but probably maybe even sarcastic. People who would use verbal forms of aggression, people who cuss people out, who are very sarcastic, very biting in their language. According to Freud, this comes from the fact that they got whatever they wanted in terms of their pleasure. The mom did not balance. And the feminist movement really attacked Freud because he's very hard on moms. Moms are always the answer to everything. It's mom's fault. Mom didn't breastfeed enough, or she didn't wean you well enough. Secondly, the anal stage from 1.5 years to 3 years of age, according to Freud, the biggest contest between moms and kids is toilet training. And your sense of competence and control as a person is developed here. So if the mother is too intense around potty training, this might make a person in childhood get constipated because mom's yelling at them and they're not going to the toilet well enough. If the mom, however, is too passive in this, then the kid becomes messy. The kid becomes tardy through her life. So Freud believed that your ability to kind of keep a room clean. Some of you probably have roommates who are very messy in the dorm. I would challenge you to go to them and bring up Freud's theory that it was really the failure of their mom to correctly potty train them, and that's what created their messiness. I actually encourage you not to mention that. That's just a joke that usually works better in an audience. So yeah, there you have it. Also, Freud, from 3 to 6, said that the phallic area was the focus of pleasure. So kids then become aware of their primary sex characteristics, so of their genitals. And here also, parents coming in as a child's in the bathtub and sees their child exploring their anatomy might become very shocked, and this would create a sense of shame. Kids who are too shame-filled. You might know someone who apologizes a lot, even for things that are not their fault. Maybe a person who lets others walk over them, doesn't have strong boundaries. Freud would believe this would come from parents who shamed their children during this stage. On the other hand, if children were allowed to touch their own genitals in public, if they were too permissive in this, then this would actually create arrogance. You can imagine what developmental psychologists do regard as genius is the fact that nobody before Freud had really suggested that early childhood interaction between parents and kids could also have long-term consequences for personality. Freud then proposed the 4th stage of latency. Many regard this to be quite preposterous, that nothing happens in personality for 6 years, even though you go to school, but because nothing's really happening in terms of sexuality. Kids are playing with kids, same-sex friends primarily. When I was in kindergarten, boys had cooties, girls had girl germs, and those kind of things. And a lot's happening here, but for Freud, not that much. So he has this theory of latency at stage 5. Stage 6 was genital stage. So here, children go through puberty and adolescence. They are capable of procreation and reproduction. And here he believes that if this is, again, either overindulged, then this could basically be a person's inability to work, right? They can't control themselves. And for Freud, again, the emphasis is on the parents to really have balanced, specifically the mom. So Freud's theory of psychoanalysis was his talk therapy that really stemmed from his personality theory. Now we'll talk more about psychoanalysis in the following chapter. Very prolific Neo-Freudians would come to light. He did not always have the best relationship with people if they disagreed with him. So Carl Jung was someone who was famous for creating a personality theory. Jung emphasized a collective unconscious. So he believed, kind of like Eastern philosophy and religion, And if you watch Star Wars, the Force, the idea of the Force, it's kind of similar to Jungian because Carl Jung was influenced by Eastern religion and myth, just as Star Wars creator George Lucas was. So they're kind of drawing from some similar wells of thought. But Jung believed that we were all connected to a collective unconscious, and like Freud, you can't prove this in a theory, in a laboratory. So the behaviorist would take great issue with these kind of quasi-religious, philosophical-oriented personality theories. However, Jung did create a test, the Myers-Briggs. So the Myers-Briggs is a personality test that's largely influenced by Jung's theory and archetypes. So whereas we cannot necessarily prove that we have a collective unconscious, can't believe that we have archetypes like the anima and the animus, the personality instrument that's being used was a standard for years, still can be found and used by psychologists. Other Neo-Freudians, like Jung, would be Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler believed that when an infant is born, there's a great sense of inferiority that they feel innately, although they can't speak. And he believes that your entire life, you're subconsciously trying to overcome this felt inferiority. And where you are placed in the birth order will sort of mitigate how inferior you feel and will mitigate lots of other personality traits. It's an interesting thought. I've asked my students about their birth order, and is the oldest child always this way? And Karen Horney comes along as one of the early feminist psychologists, I would say very influential in the field of feminist psychology, and she really took Freud to task over his ideas as being very androcentric, very male-oriented. So she rejected his notion that anatomy is destiny. Freud actually believed that men were to be extroverted because their genitals were outside of them. Now, that sounds very archaic, but he actually taught that. And Karen Horney took that to task. Also, he believed that because of females' primary sex characteristics, a woman's gonads, her ovaries were inside, that women were going to be introverted. So Freud actually believed that your reproductive organs dictated personality. And she was one of the first to really to attack this. And she would say anatomy is not destiny. Erikson was the first to kind of emphasize social relationships. Freud didn't really talk a lot about how social relationships among peers affect the personality because he was so focused on how the mother interacted with the child's socially unacceptable behaviors. So some current research is being done on defense mechanisms. This was a very important topic for Freud, and it's one of those things that I think everybody should learn about, defense mechanisms like denial or repression or displacement or sublimation. Just for the sake of time, we don't deal with it as much as I would like to, but I do deal with it and address the subject of defense mechanisms in some of my other classes. So we're going to look at other perspectives, and moving forward, we'll talk about behaviorism. Behaviorism focuses on habits, as I've said. They define personality in a totally different manner than Freud would. They would say your personality is simply a set of learned responses or habits. Remember what I said, you are what you repeatedly do, according to the behaviorists. And so the social learning theorists would come along and they would focus on the importance of your expectations. So how you act is largely impacted by how you think others will react. You may wear a shirt and others compliment you, and the next time you're at the store, you buy a similar shirt. It's a little different because you think people are going to reward you for that. The social learning, social cognitive view says that eventually we start learning through our anticipation of judgment. We remember how people respond to how we act, and this forms our personality. Behaviorism believes in a reciprocal determination. So we have personal, environmental, and behavioral factors that interact to shape our behavior, which in turn affects our self-efficacy. So I act, there is a response, then that impacts how I feel and think about my actions, which then affects more actions, which affects reactions. So it's a constant cycle of anticipating and expecting response and therefore acting. There's a lot of overlap between this idea and sociology. If you take my sociology, George Herbert Mead was as a sociologist, very influenced by behaviorism. However, the third force in personality theory took the behaviorist to task and argued with Freudian psychodynamic theory and psychoanalytic personality view. The humanists thought that the behaviorists were just really too deterministic. If something outside of you impacts you, your environment is 100% responsible for who you are, and that was antithetical to their premise that there are certain traits that make you uniquely human, and specifically your right to choose and to be a volitional decision maker. So they also felt that the early days of psychoanalytic personality theory were too negative. This idea that humans are secretly serial killers and sexual deviants, and it's only by the luck of good enough mothering that we don't heed our truly edinal animalistic desires. Very negative to the humanist. And our culture has really become very humanistic. The idea of identity, you can't determine my identity, I determine my identity, it's very humanistic in its root. So Rogers, as well as Abraham Maslow, both humanistic. Rogers especially talked about the self-actualizing tendency. Humanists believe, unlike Freud, that we're basically good, and that our self-concept is being formed and we can impact our own self-concept, but it is, especially early on, it's impacted by the interaction with other people. So if we fast forward, the sense of self is really important to the humanist. Now you have two concepts, and instead of talking about this, I like explaining it in my own terms better, and I like using this graph. Hold on a second. So I think of the ideal self as, you can write this down, pause it if you need to. The ideal self is who you think you are, and the real self, according to Rogers, is who you think you should be. And if there is a pretty close, harmonious relationship between the person you think you should be and the person that you think you are, then you're going to have good mental health. However, if you are incongruous, is a good word for this, if there's great incongruity, so for instance, the person who you think you are is way different from the person who you think you should be, then Rogers would say that's a great deal of incongruity, and this leads to mental health issues and anxiety. So this notion of self-love is something that you hear a lot in our culture. Love yourself, self-love. This is very Rogerian, it's very humanistic. And I would say that we are really building our society on the humanistic ideals, whereas the world I grew up in the late 70s and 80s was very influenced by Freud and Freudian ideas. Rogers believed that what we need to develop in our personality is positive regard, which is warmth and affection, love and respect. And more specifically, we need unconditional positive regard. So even when I may not be doing what a person would like me to, or I'm not doing something that's constructive, I'm still given unconditional positive regard. Carl Rogers believed that therapists and counselors should give unconditional positive regard, or UPR. However, he said most kids don't receive this from their parents. Most kids receive conditions of worth. So I love you if. So love is merit-based and not relationally based. And positive regard is given only when providers' wishes are fulfilled. When we look at the trait theories, now real quick, on our discussion board, I will be asking you if you've ever known anyone who had conditions of worth, and if you've ever felt as though someone in any relationship, that could be a parent, you certainly don't have to share anything that's too personal, but have you ever felt that you would only be loved if you did something that that person in relationship wanted you to? In that case, you felt the relationship and love and acceptance was merit-based. And conversely, have you ever had a relationship where you felt unconditional love by this person? So let's talk a little bit about the final school of thought, trait theory. Trait theories describe characteristics for the purpose of prediction. This is a school of thought that leans heavily on genetics. A trait is a consistent, enduring way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. And they stem from a psychologist, famous psychologist, Gordon Allport, who listed 200 traits that he believed part of the nervous system. Now, the 200 traits, this is great, but it's really hard to manage and to measure. And again, that's what trait theorists were most interested in. So a guy named Raymond Cattell reduced the number of traits from 16 and 23. And what he did is he created this 16PF, the 16 personality factors. What you see here is a research study that was later built on this idea. So you have 16 personality factors on the left, and on the right you have their polar opposite. So respondents are simply asked to rank themselves. Then the same test is given to people in different fields. So you have, let's say hypothetically, 1,000 pilots chosen at random are given this 16PF, and 1,000 writers are chosen at random and given the 16PF. And it's a very simplistic but yet very robust, powerful research design, because it shows us that on average pilots are more reserved than they are outgoing. And if you're very reserved, and if you like abstract thinking, and if you are emotionally stable, if you trend towards dominance in your personality, you like being right, confident, well then pilot might be a great career for you. So there's a very pragmatic element to trait theory. Trait theorists would continue on and reduce the 16PF even further. So we have surface traits, which hold that outward actions of a person are what are seen, but the source traits are what drive this. So let's say you have someone in the dorm, they like withdrawing, they like being alone, and The source trait, however, is what drives that. So introversion would be the source trait, and therefore the surface trait would be withdrawal. And this is important because it helped two other theorists, Costa and McCrae, break personality down even more. And again, yes, they created a test. So they created what was known as the Big Five theory. It is known by an acronym of the left-hand side, right? The NEO, neuroticism, agreeableness, or let's say neuroticism, extroversion, and openness, personality inventory. So the NEO-Pi was the test built on the Big Five